There is an ability that empaths carry, the capacity to perceive what others are not showing, to sense what is underneath the surface of what people present. That is both their most significant gift and, when it is not understood correctly, the source of their most persistent exhaustion. Most empaths know this perception is real. They have experienced it too consistently, in too many contexts, with too much accuracy to doubt it. What they rarely understand is what this perception actually is, why it works the way it does, and what the specific difference is between using it in a way that depletes and isolates them and using it in a way that produces depth, clarity, and genuine contribution. That difference is what this video is about, what empaths call deep perception, the capacity to sense beneath the surface, to read what is unexpressed, to know things about people that the person has not disclosed, is not, in Jung's framework, mysterious or inexplicable. It has a specific psychological mechanism. Jung's concept of the feeling function, developed in detail in his 1921 work, Psychological Types, identifies feeling not as emotion, but as a specific cognitive and evaluative function, the function of the psyche that assesses value, quality, and relational significance. For individuals in whom this function is dominant and highly developed, the capacity to perceive the relational and emotional dimensions of any situation is not something they do deliberately. It is how the psyche processes reality. The deep perception that empaths experience is the feeling function operating at a high level of development. But the feeling function alone does not explain the full depth of what the empath perceives. The additional mechanism, the one that gives empathic perception its particular quality of access, is what Jung called participation mystique. Drawn from the anthropologist Levi Bruhl and applied to psychological experience, participation mystique describes a state of unconscious psychological merger between one individual's psyche and another's. In this state, the boundary between self and other is sufficiently permeable that emotional and psychic content flows across it without conscious awareness. The empath does not merely observe another person from a clearly defined distance. At the unconscious level, they partially inhabit the same psychic space, and this partial inhabitation is what gives empathic perception its quality of directness, its sense of knowing from the inside rather than inferring from the outside. If you're an empath who has been living with this perception without a framework that fully explains what it is or how to work with it, subscribe to this channel. This is where that framework lives. The word correctly in the title of this video is deliberate and important. Most empaths do not use this perception incorrectly out of carelessness or a failure of effort. They use it incorrectly because no one has given them a framework for what the perception actually is, how it operates, and what relationship to it produces depth rather than depletion. The default mode for most empaths, absorbing what is perceived, taking responsibility for what belongs to others, losing the boundary between their own interior and the emotional field of the people around them, is not a personal failing. It is the natural consequence of possessing a capacity that has never been properly understood. Understanding what the perception actually is, at a structural level, is the first step toward using it in a way that serves rather than drains. But here is the distinction that changes everything about the empath's relationship with this gift, and that Jung's framework makes possible to draw with precision. There is a fundamental difference between perceiving something and being identified with what is perceived. The empath who perceives another person's unexpressed grief, suppressed fear, or unacknowledged rage has genuinely perceived something real. The difficulty begins, and the depletion begins, not in the perception itself, but in what the empath does with it, when they absorb it, carry it, or attempt to resolve it as though it were their own interior reality rather than information about another's. The path from deep perception as burden to deep perception as gift runs entirely through this one distinction. Jung's feeling function, as described in Psychological Types, is frequently misunderstood in popular accounts as simply the capacity for emotional response. But in the Jungian typological framework, feeling is a rational function, a function of judgment and evaluation, oriented toward the assessment of value, meaning, and relational quality. The feeling type does not simply react emotionally. They process the world through a finely calibrated capacity for recognizing what matters, what resonates, what is genuine versus what is performed, what is aligned versus what is in conflict. For the empath, whose primary function is feeling in this developed sense, the perception of others operates at a level of sophistication that thinking-dominant individuals frequently find difficult to account for, because it registers dimensions of reality that the thinking function is not designed to track. The participation mystique that enables empathic deep perception is not a metaphysical phenomenon. It is a psychological one that operates through the unconscious. When an empath enters into relationship, any relationship, from a sustained intimate one to a brief encounter in a shared space, the unconscious is already engaged in a process that the conscious mind has not requested or initiated. The permeable unconscious boundary of the feeling dominant type allows emotional and psychic content from the other person's unconscious to enter the empath's field before any conscious analysis has occurred. What this produces is the characteristic empath experience, the sense of knowing something about a person that has not yet been said, the felt sense of an emotional reality that is not one's own, the body's response to a field it has partially entered without being consciously aware of having done so. What empaths are primarily perceiving, at the level that makes the perception most significant and most disorienting, is the gap between what another person presents consciously and what they carry below the surface. Every person operates to varying degrees from a persona, the face they have constructed to navigate social reality, shaped by what the environment has shown itself willing to receive. Below the persona lies the interior reality that the persona was partly constructed to manage. The empath's deep perception consistently gravitates toward this gap, toward the unexpressed grief underneath the composed exterior, the fear underneath the confident presentation, the longing underneath the self-sufficiency. This is not inference. It is a form of direct registration. The empath's unconscious perceives what the other person's persona is attempting to contain. Among the most significant dimensions of empathic deep perception, and the one with the most far-reaching implications, is the capacity to perceive another person's shadow before the person perceives it themselves. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is the sum of everything the conscious personality cannot acknowledge, the suppressed qualities, unprocessed emotions, and unlived dimensions of the self that have been delegated to the unconscious. The person who has not done shadow work does not see this material, but it is nonetheless present, operating in their behavioral patterns, emotional reactions, and interpersonal dynamics. The empath, through the combination of a developed feeling function and a permeable unconscious boundary, registers this shadow material. They sense the anger the other person denies, the longing they cannot admit, the wound they have never examined. This is among the most accurate and most socially uncomfortable dimensions of empathic perception, the mechanism that produces one of the empath's most characteristic experiences, the sense of suddenly feeling emotions that do not belong to them, the unexpected shift in interior state that corresponds to proximity to another person or entry into a particular relational field, is what Jung's framework describes as psychic contagion. Psychic contagion is the transmission of psychological states across the permeable unconscious boundary, without conscious mediation. The empath who enters a room and feels the tension of a conflict no one has mentioned, or who speaks with someone and suddenly finds themselves carrying a heaviness that was not present before, is experiencing psychic contagion. The states being transmitted are real. They originate in another's interior, and they arrive in the empath's interior through the unconscious channel before the conscious mind has had an opportunity to register or filter them. The body is not incidental to empathic deep perception. It is the primary instrument through which the perception operates. Before the empath's conscious mind has processed what is happening in a relational field, the body has already registered it. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a sudden fatigue that has no apparent origin, a quality of aliveness or expansion that corresponds to the arrival of a specific person. These somatic signals are the body's translation of what the unconscious has already perceived, the felt residue of the psychic contagion that has already occurred at the unconscious level. Understanding the body as an instrument of perception, rather than simply as a container of one's own emotional states, is one of the most important recognitions available to the empath who is learning to work correctly with deep perception. The question that many who first encounter the empath's capacity for deep perception find themselves asking is, how accurate is it, really? The answer, from the Jungian framework, is that it is more accurate than the empath typically realizes, and accurate in a specific direction. What the empath perceives is primarily the communication of the other person's unconscious. The unconscious communicates constantly through tone, micro-expression, behavioral pattern, energetic quality, and the particular way a person inhabits or does not inhabit their own presence. Most people register only a fraction of this communication consciously. The empath, with a highly developed feeling function and a permeable unconscious boundary, registers far more. The perception is not infallible, but its accuracy, when the empath is differentiated enough to distinguish their own material from what is being perceived, tends to be significantly higher than the empath's own confidence in it would suggest. And here is what makes this capacity genuinely extraordinary, and simultaneously what makes it, in the empath who has not learned to work with it consciously, one of the most reliable sources of exhaustion, confusion, and relational pain they will encounter. If you recognize what is being described, if this is the interior experience of perceiving others that you have been living with, often without the language to explain it to anyone else, write in the comments, "My perception is my gift." That recognition is the beginning of everything. The wounded healer principle that Jung articulated has specific implications for understanding why the empath's deep perception exists at the level it does. The wound, the early experience of emotional vulnerability, of navigating a relational environment that required constant attunement to others in order to feel safe, is not separate from the perceptive capacity. It is its source. The child who had to learn, very early, how to read the emotional field of the adults around them, to sense approaching difficulty before it arrived, to detect the gap between what was expressed and what was felt, developed, through that necessity, a sensitivity that in adult life becomes the foundation of deep perception. The wound did not incidentally produce the gift. The wound is what the gift is made of, and this is why the development of the gift is inseparable from the examination of the wound. The early environment that produces empathic deep perception is consistently characterized by a specific set of conditions: relational complexity that required navigation, emotional states that needed to be read without being named, and circumstances in which the child's well-being depended on their capacity to attune to others rather than simply expressing their own interior. This does not require a traumatic environment in the clinical sense. It requires an environment in which the feeling function was called upon early and consistently. in which reading the emotional field of the relational environment was not optional but necessary. The result, across years of this necessity, is a perceptive capacity that develops to an unusually high level, and that by the time the person reaches adulthood, operates with an automatic and deeply ingrained fluency that often exceeds their own conscious awareness of it. The perception that the empath now experiences as a gift began as a survival skill. This origin is not incidental. It shapes the way the perception operates in ways that remain active in adulthood unless they are consciously examined. A skill developed for survival is calibrated toward detecting threat, toward reading what is wrong, what is about to shift adversely, what is not being said that needs to be navigated. The empath who has not examined this origin often finds that their deep perception is more reliably activated by difficulty than by well-being, more attuned to suppressed distress than to suppressed joy, more alert to what is hidden because it is dangerous than to what is hidden because it has not yet found the conditions for expression. Using the perception correctly requires recognizing this calibration and consciously expanding it beyond the survival orientation that produced it. The default mode of the empath, who has not learned to work consciously with deep perception, is absorption without differentiation, perceiving what is in the other person's field and taking it in as though it were one's own interior reality. This is the root of the characteristic empath experience of exhaustion, emotional overload, and the sense that the world is simply too much. What is experienced as too much is not actually the perception itself. The perception is a capacity, not a burden in itself. What is experienced as too much is the absorption that follows the perception when there is no conscious practice of differentiation in place. The empath perceives another's suppressed grief, then, without differentiation, inhabits that grief as though it originated in themselves. The perception takes a moment. The absorption can last for hours. One of the most consistent and most psychologically costly errors that empaths make, and one that the Jungian framework identifies with precision, is the confusion between one's own emotional states and those absorbed from others through psychic contagion. This confusion is not simple. It operates at a level that is below ordinary conscious awareness, and it can persist even when the empath has considerable intellectual understanding of what is happening. The empath who wakes with an inexplicable heaviness, who experiences a sudden shift in emotional state that has no apparent internal cause, who feels genuinely overwhelmed in the presence of certain people, is frequently carrying states that originated elsewhere. The cost of this confusion is not merely the discomfort of carrying what is not theirs. It is the progressive inability to locate their own actual interior, to know with clarity what they themselves feel. The perception of another person's unprocessed emotional material, their suppressed grief, their unacknowledged fear, the shadow material they have not yet examined, frequently activates in the empath not simply awareness, but responsibility. The empath perceives the wound, and without having made a conscious decision to do so, takes on the function of managing it, attempting to resolve the other person's emotional difficulty, to smooth what was uncomfortable, to carry what the other person cannot yet carry themselves. This is one of the most characteristic patterns of the empath who is not using the perception correctly, and one of the most reliably depleting. What is being carried does not belong to the empath. It belongs to the person who produced it, and carrying what belongs to another does not relieve them of it. It simply prevents both people from relating to it accurately. The exhaustion that so many empaths report is not a consequence of sensitivity itself. It is a consequence of perception without containment. When what is perceived enters the empath's interior field without any conscious practice of differentiation, without the capacity to recognize, I am perceiving this and it is not mine, The psychic field fills with material that has no clear origin and no clear boundary. The empath cannot tell what is theirs and what has been absorbed. They cannot locate the source of their fatigue or their distress. They cannot regulate what they have not differentiated. And the relentless accumulation of uncontained perceptive material produces a characteristic exhaustion that has nothing to do with external demands on the empath's time or energy. It is the exhaustion of a psychic field that has never been given the opportunity to empty itself. There is a form of error that is specific to highly developed perception, and that is particularly important for empaths to recognize: the confusion between genuine perception and projection. The empath who perceives something in another person's field, who senses what appears to be unexpressed anger, hidden agenda, or unacknowledged wound, may be accurately perceiving the other, or they may be projecting their own unexamined shadow material onto the other and experiencing the projection as perception. The difference is not always immediately distinguishable from the inside. The emotional charge is similar. The sense of certainty can be equally strong in both cases. What distinguishes genuine perception from projection requires the empath to maintain a consistent practice of examining what in themselves might be generating what they believe they are seeing in others. This examination is one of the specific practices that makes the perception accurate rather than distorting. Closely related to the confusion between perception and projection is what might be called the inflation of the perception. The tendency of the empath, particularly in the early stages of recognizing and valuing this capacity, to attribute a certainty to what is perceived that the perception does not actually warrant. Deep perception is real. It is significantly more accurate than ordinary social observation, but it is not infallible. It is subject to the same distortions as any perceptive capacity: the shadow that has not been examined, the emotional charge that the empath is carrying from previous experience, the unconscious projections that the empath has not yet recognized as theirs. The empath, who treats their perceptions as direct and unmediated access to truth, rather than as highly reliable but fallible information, makes errors that damage relationships and undermine the very trust the accuracy of the perception would otherwise deserve. But here is the correction that changes the empath's entire relationship with this perception. And it is simpler than it appears, though not easy. It requires not the suppression of what is perceived, not the distancing from others, not the management of sensitivity as though it were a liability. It requires one specific interior capacity that the Jungian framework names precisely, and that, once genuinely developed, transforms the entire experience of being an empath. If this is giving you the clearest language you have encountered for what it is actually like to carry this perception, write it in the comments or let me know by liking the video. This kind of depth is worth continuing. Jung's typological framework identifies a dynamic that has direct practical implications for the empath's experience: the relationship between the dominant function and the inferior function. For the feeling dominant type, the inferior function, the one most likely to be undeveloped and therefore most likely to create difficulty, is thinking, the function of logical analysis, systematic organization, and rational evaluation. The empath who perceives at depth what is happening in another person's field often struggles to organize that perception coherently, to identify what specifically was perceived, to evaluate it critically, to decide consciously what to do with it rather than simply being acted upon by it. The underdeveloped thinking function means that the perception arrives without the analytical scaffolding that would allow it to be worked with deliberately. Developing a functional relationship with the thinking function, even as a secondary capacity, is one of the specific practices that allows the empath to use what they perceive rather than simply being used by it. The patterns that the incorrect use of deep perception creates in the empath's relationships are consistent enough to be recognizable as a signature. The empath who perceives without differentiation tends to attract relationships that confirm the perception as responsibility, people whose emotional needs are substantial, whose shadow material is pronounced, whose interior difficulties are visible to the empath in ways that activate the absorption and caretaking pattern. The empath's depth of perception makes them extraordinarily valuable as a relational presence. But without the practice of differentiation, that value is extracted rather than genuinely received. The empath gives what they have perceived without the other person having done the work of offering it. The relationship sustains itself on the empath's unrecompensated perceptive labor. And the empath, without understanding what is happening, wonders why their depth is never fully met. The foundational distinction for learning to use deep perception correctly is the distinction between perceiving and interpreting. Perception is the registration of what is actually present in the other's field, the emotional state, the unexpressed content, the gap between persona and interior. Interpretation is what the empath's mind does with what is perceived, the narrative it constructs around it, the meaning it assigns, the conclusion it draws about what the perception requires of the empath in response. Most of the errors that empaths make with this gift occur not in the perception itself, but in the interpretation, in the story built on top of what was perceived, often colored by the empath's own history, their own shadow, their own unexamined assumptions about what the perception means and what it demands. The practice of holding perception as information, not as obligation, not as command, not as the complete story, is the entry point into correct use. Differentiation, the practice of consciously distinguishing what originates in the self from what has been absorbed from others, is the central Jungian practice for the empath who wants to use deep perception correctly. It is not complicated in principle, though it requires consistent attention in practice. Before engaging with what has been perceived in another's field, the empath pauses, briefly but genuinely, to establish what their own interior state was before the perception occurred. What was present internally before this person arrived, before this conversation began, before entering this space? That baseline is the reference point. What has arrived since? What has shifted, what has been added, what is now present that was not before, is the candidate for what was absorbed from outside. The practice of establishing and returning to this baseline repeatedly is how differentiation becomes functional rather than theoretical. One of the most valuable and least recognized correct uses of deep perception is as a tool for self-knowledge. What the empath perceives in others consistently reflects, in part, dimensions of the empath's own interior that have not been fully examined. The empath who is consistently drawn to perceive another person's suppressed grief is likely carrying grief of their own that has not been fully processed. The empath whose perception gravitates reliably toward another's unacknowledged anger may be carrying anger that their own conscious identity has not given room to acknowledge. This is not an invalidation of the perception's accuracy about the other person. The perception of the other can be entirely accurate and still be reflecting something real in the empath. Learning to ask, alongside the perception of another, what does this perceiving reveal about me, is one of the most generative practices the empath can develop. The empath's own shadow, the material that the conscious identity has not been willing or able to integrate, is consistently present in what activates the perception most powerfully. What the empath finds most emotionally charged in their perception of others, the qualities that produce the strongest resonance, the reactions they cannot remain neutral about, the people whose shadow material lands with disproportionate force. These are reliable indicators of where the empath's own shadow work remains incomplete. using the charge of the perception as a pointer toward one's own interior rather than as confirmation of something that requires engagement with the other, is one of the specific practices that separates the empath who grows through the gift from the empath who is exhausted by it. The perception becomes a mirror as much as a window, and the mirror dimension is where the most significant personal development occurs. The feeling function, understood correctly as an evaluative faculty rather than as a vehicle for merger, becomes a genuinely useful instrument when the empath relates to it as information gathering rather than as identification. The feeling function evaluates. It assesses value, quality, relational reality. It is not designed at its best to produce fusion with what is evaluated. The sculptor does not become the clay. The navigator does not become the sea. The empath who develops the capacity to use the feeling function as a skilled evaluator, who can sense what is present in another's field, assess its quality and significance, and return to their own interior after the assessment, is using the function at its highest level of development. This requires the prior development of sufficient interior stability that the perception can be completed without being followed automatically by absorption. That stability is the work of individuation. If you have been carrying this perception for years and sensing that there is a layer of working with it, developing it, protecting it, using it correctly, that understanding alone cannot fully unlock. I have left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to move beyond insight into genuine practice. When psychic contagion has already occurred, when the empath has already absorbed an emotional state from another's field before differentiation was possible, the correct practice is containment before transmission. Containment means, before doing anything with what has been absorbed, establishing that it has been absorbed, noticing it. Naming it internally, not to the other person, not in any external form, but as a private interior acknowledgement. This is here. It arrived from outside. It is not mine to carry indefinitely. This internal acknowledgement creates the first separation between the empath and the absorbed material. It moves the material from automatic absorption into conscious awareness. And what is in conscious awareness can be worked with, returned, released, or processed in ways that what remains unconscious cannot be. The body's role in correct use of the perception is specifically as instrument rather than as victim. The somatic signals that the empath receives, the tightening, the heaviness, the expansion, the shift in physical aliveness, are information. They are the body's translation of what the unconscious has perceived. Reading these signals correctly means treating them as the first layer of data about what is present in the relational field, and then engaging the conscious mind to work with that data rather than simply inhabiting the somatic state as though it were the whole of the experience. The empath who has learned to ask, "What is my body telling me is happening here?" rather than simply being the experience the body is reporting, has made the transition from instrument being played to musician playing the instrument. The body remains the receptor. The conscious mind becomes the interpreter and the one who decides what to do. The experiential difference between presence and merger, between the empath who is genuinely with another person and the empath who has lost themselves in the other's field, is one of the most important distinctions to develop the capacity to feel from the inside. Presence is the quality of being fully engaged with another's reality while remaining anchored in one's own. Merger is the loss of that anchor, the sense of having been absorbed into the other's emotional field to the point where one's own interior is no longer clearly locatable. Presence makes genuine contact possible. Merger prevents it, because genuine contact requires two distinct presences, not one presence that has absorbed another. The empath in merger is not fully present to the other. They are lost in the other, and what is lost in the other cannot offer what it alone can provide. Solitude performs a specific and essential function for the empath who is learning to use deep perception correctly. It is not simply recovery time from the demands of social engagement. It is the primary context in which the empath can locate their own interior with clarity, can distinguish what is genuinely theirs from what was absorbed during relational contact, can process and release what accumulated during engagement with others, and can return to the felt sense of their own baseline before the relational field filled with external material. For the empath who has not understood this function, solitude can feel like withdrawal or failure. Understood correctly, it is a structural necessity, the equivalent of the instrument being retuned after an extended performance. Without regular solitude, the empath's perception loses its calibration and its accuracy, and the boundary between self and other becomes progressively more difficult to locate. In relationships, the correctly used perception of the empath makes possible a quality of encounter that is genuinely unusual and genuinely valuable to both parties. The empath who has differentiated, who can perceive what is present in another's field without absorbing it or taking responsibility for it, who can remain present with another's difficulty without being destabilized by it, offers a relational quality that the other person rarely encounters. The quality of being genuinely known, of having one's interior registered and met with steady, non-reactive presence, is among the most healing experiences available in human relationship. This is what the correctly used deep perception of the empath enables, not the fixing of what the empath perceives, not the management of what is uncomfortable, simply the steady, differentiated presence that says, I see what is here and I am not disturbed by it. I remain. Vocationally, the empath, with a correctly developed and correctly used deep perception, carries something into their work that cannot be replicated by skill or knowledge alone, the capacity to perceive what is actually happening beneath the surface of the situation. In counseling, teaching, leadership, creative work, healing practices, and any form of work that involves sustained engagement with human experience, this capacity translates into an accuracy of response that others without it cannot match. The empath who has developed the perception correctly does not simply respond to what is presented. They respond to what is actually present, to the unexpressed need, the unacknowledged pattern, the dimension of the situation that no one has yet named. This perceptive accuracy, combined with the technical skills of the empath's specific vocation, produces work of a quality and a depth that is increasingly rare and increasingly needed. The individuation process, Jung's term for the lifelong movement toward the fullest expression of the self's own nature, is not only the context within which the empath's perception can be correctly used. It is the container that makes correct use possible at all. The empath who is individuating, who is engaged in the ongoing work of examining the shadow, differentiating themselves from the collective, developing a stable sense of their own interior, has the interior stability that correct use requires. The perception can be fully engaged without producing merger because there is a genuinely developed self to return to. The empath who has not yet engaged the individuation process lacks this container. The perception activates, the absorption follows, and there is no sufficiently stable interior to serve as the anchor. The development of the self is the development of the capacity to use the gift. And this is the turn that changes the empath's entire relationship with what they carry. Not a reduction of the perception, not a management of the sensitivity, something that the Jungian framework identifies as the specific interior development that converts the gift from burden to capacity, and that once genuinely in place makes possible a quality of engagement with others and with the world that the empath's full depth has always been capable of producing. What the correct use of deep perception produces in the empath's experience of relationship is a quality of genuine contact that few people ever access. Not the managed proximity of social exchange in which both parties remain safely behind their personas. Not the painful merger of the undifferentiated empath who is dissolved into another's field. Something qualitatively different. The sustained presence of a self that can perceive what is actually happening in another's interior and remain steady with it, can receive another's unexpressed reality without flinching, without fixing, without needing it to be different than it is. This quality of contact, being genuinely met at the level of what is actually true rather than at the level of what is presented, is among the rarest and most healing experiences available in human relationship. The empath who has learned to use the perception correctly carries the capacity to provide it. Reading the shadow in another person correctly, using the perception of another's unacknowledged material in a way that genuinely serves rather than intrudes, requires a specific quality of restraint that the correctly using empath develops over time. What is perceived about another's shadow is not automatically the empath's to address, name, or work with. The perception is information, accurate information often, but information about the other person's interior that the other person has not yet chosen to bring into conscious engagement. The correctly using empath holds this information lightly, as context for understanding rather than as content to be delivered, as an orientation for how to be present rather than as a revelation to be disclosed. The shadow can only be genuinely worked with by the person whose shadow it is. The empath's role is presence that makes the working with possible, not the work itself performed on behalf of the other. The transcendent function, Jung's concept of the psyche's capacity to hold two opposite conditions simultaneously and allow a new synthesis to emerge, has a specific application in the correctly using empath's experience. The empath who perceives both what another person presents consciously and what they carry unconsciously is holding, simultaneously, two realities about the same person. The capacity to hold both without collapsing into either, without either accepting the persona at face value or confronting the shadow material directly, allows something to emerge from the tension that neither pole alone would produce. A quality of relationship that holds the full complexity of the other person without demanding resolution in either direction. This is the transcendent function as relational practice. And it is the specific quality that makes the empath, at their most developed, an extraordinary companion for other people's interior journeys. Knowing when not to use the deep perception, when to consciously set down the perceptive function and engage with another person at the surface level they have chosen to present, is one of the most significant and most nuanced dimensions of correct use. Not every interaction calls for depth. Not every person who enters the empath's field is in a moment or a context in which the shadow-level perception is welcome or useful. The empath who is consistently operating at maximum perceptive depth in every interaction burns through relational resources at a rate that is ultimately unsustainable. Part of correct use is developing the discernment to match the depth of the perception to what the situation actually calls for. To engage fully when depth is invited and possible, and to hold the perception lightly when the context does not support or require it. The empath's deep perception has implications that extend beyond personal relationships to the broader collective. In a cultural moment characterized by pronounced disconnection from interiority, by a pervasive difficulty with genuine emotional depth, authentic self-examination, and sustained encounter with what is actually true. The empath's capacity to perceive beneath the surface and remain present with what is found, there is not merely a personal gift, it is a collective need. The individuals who can model genuine interior engagement, who can hold space for what is difficult without collapsing or retreating, who can perceive the shadow in collective patterns and name it with the accuracy their function provides. These individuals serve a function in the collective that no amount of intellectual analysis or technical competence can substitute for. Protecting the perception, maintaining the conditions that allow it to remain accurate, calibrated and available, requires the empath to understand what depletes it and what sustains it. What depletes the perception is sustained exposure to psychic contagion without the counterbalance of regular differentiation practice, solitude, and return to the interior baseline. What sustains it is the ongoing development of the empath's own interior life, the shadow work, the individuation process, the cultivation of a genuine self that is sufficiently stable to serve as the perceptive instrument without being overwhelmed by what is perceived. The perception is not self-sustaining, it is a capacity of the self, and it depends entirely on the development and maintenance of that self for the accuracy and the availability that make it genuinely useful. Deep perception and creative work have a relationship that many empaths discover over time, but rarely have a framework for understanding. The same capacity that allows the empath to register what is unexpressed in another person's interior, the attunement to what has not yet found form, the sensitivity to what is present beneath the surface of the presented, also operates in the empath's relationship to their own creative process. The empath who writes or makes music or works in any medium that requires access to interior reality is drawing on the same perceptive function that makes their relational capacity so distinctive. The creative work is, in a significant sense, a form of deep perception applied inward, the registration and translation of interior material that has not yet been given form. And for the empath, the creative practice is often one of the most reliable means of processing and integrating what the perception accumulates. What mastery of the deep perception gift looks like in practice, not as an idealized end state, but as a quality that develops gradually and unevenly over years, is not a dramatic change in the empath's experience of the world. The perception does not become quieter. The sensitivity does not reduce. What changes is the empath's relationship to it. The perception is received with less anxiety and less automatic reaction. The differentiation practice is sufficiently established that absorption does not occur as reliably. The interior baseline is familiar enough to be returned to without significant effort. And the empath is able to make conscious choices, more of the time, not always, about how to engage with what is perceived, what to hold, what to release, what to offer, and when the perception is best kept as private interior knowledge rather than transmitted. The mastery is in the relationship to the gift, not in the elimination of its complexity. The empath's deep perception, at its most developed and most correctly used, is a form of love, and specifically the most accurate form of love available to human relationship. Not love as sentiment or affection, not love as idealization of the other, but love in the sense that the great traditions of wisdom have consistently described as its most mature expression. The capacity to perceive another person clearly, to see what is genuinely present rather than what is preferred, to register the shadow alongside the persona, to witness the interior reality alongside the projected image, and to remain present, steady, and genuinely caring in response to all of it. This is what the correctly using empath offers, and this capacity to be truly seen without being judged, truly known without being fixed, is among the most transformative gifts one human being can offer another. The contribution that the correctly using empath makes to the people whose lives intersect with theirs is specific and irreplaceable. It cannot be provided by intellectual understanding alone, by good intentions alone, by technical skill alone, or by any combination of capacities that does not include the empath's particular form of perceptive access to interior reality. What the empath offers, when the gift is genuinely developed and correctly used, is the quality of being with another person in their actual interior, rather than in the version of themselves they have offered to the world. Most people go through their lives rarely or never experiencing this form of genuine encounter. The empath, who has done the work to use the perception correctly, provides it naturally, in the ordinary course of their relationships and their presence. And the people who receive it, even briefly, even partially, are changed by the encounter in ways that neither party may be immediately able to articulate. The empath, who has genuinely integrated this gift, who has done the work of differentiation, developed the interior stability that individuation requires, and learned to use what is perceived rather than simply being acted upon by it, experiences something that transforms the entire landscape of being an empath. What was chronic exhaustion becomes sustained engagement. What was the burden of perceiving what no one else names becomes the specific resource that only this person can bring. What was the loneliness of seeing too much becomes the foundation of a relational depth that others seek out precisely because of its rarity. The gift does not become smaller. It becomes carried differently by a self that is strong enough, stable enough, and developed enough to be the instrument rather than the one being played. The specific gift that the empath carries, the capacity to perceive beneath the surface, to remain present with what is found there, to offer the quality of genuine encounter that accurate perception and steady presence together make possible, is not common. It is not produced by good intentions. It is not cultivated by effort alone or by the acquisition of relational skills. It is built from the particular combination of developed sensitivity, genuine interior work, and the specific intelligence of the feeling function operating at a high level of development. Very few people carry all of these simultaneously, and what they make possible in relationships, in vocational contribution, in the quality of presence they bring to the collective, is needed at a depth and a consistency that the empath's developed gift uniquely provides. The world, at this particular moment in its development, is not suffering primarily from a shortage of intelligence or information or technical capacity. What it is most acutely short of is the quality of genuine interior engagement, the willingness to perceive what is actually present beneath the surface of presented reality, to remain with what is difficult rather than retreating to what is comfortable, to meet another person at the level of what is true rather than at the level of what is manageable. This is precisely what the correctly using empath offers. Not as a specialist or as a practitioner of a specific vocation, but as a quality of presence that operates wherever they are, in every relationship, every encounter, every context in which they bring the depth of their developed perception into genuine engagement with what is actually there. The courage that correct use of deep perception requires from the empath is not the courage of confrontation or the courage of dramatic action. It is the quieter and more sustained courage of remaining with the perception, of continuing to perceive accurately, to remain present with what is found, to resist the retreat into comfortable unawareness that the difficulty of the perception consistently invites. It is the courage of allowing the gift to be fully what it is, penetrating, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes socially costly, not always welcome, not always easy to carry. The empath who develops this courage does not find the perception easier. They find themselves more genuinely equal to what it requires, and that capacity to remain with what the perception shows rather than retreating from it is what ultimately distinguishes the empath who is transformed by the gift from the one who is only exhausted by it. The development of deep perception in the direction of genuine mastery is irreversible, in the same way that any genuine psychological development is irreversible. The empath who has done the differentiation work, who has developed the interior stability, established the practice of returning to the baseline, and learned to hold what is perceived without immediate absorption, cannot unknow what this capacity makes possible. The perception does not retreat. The gift does not diminish. What has been built into the self through genuine interior work becomes part of the self's actual structure. And this means that every subsequent engagement, every relationship, every encounter, every moment in which the perception is brought into contact with another's reality, is met by a self more capable of using what is perceived than the self that preceded the development. What was always true about the empath's deep perception, even before they had a framework for understanding it, even before they recognized it as a gift rather than as a liability, even during the years in which it produced primarily confusion and exhaustion, is that it was always accurate, not perfectly, not without the distortions that the empath's own shadow and unexamined history introduced, but at its core, registering something real about the interior reality of the people and situations it encountered. The years of carrying it before understanding it were not wasted. They were the accumulation of an enormous amount of perceptive data about human experience, about the gap between what is shown and what is real, about the depths of what people carry and what they need. That accumulated understanding does not disappear when the correct use is learned. It becomes the substance from which the gift genuinely developed is made. The life that opens for the empath who has genuinely developed this gift, who has moved from absorption without differentiation to perception with stable presence, is not simply a more comfortable version of the life they were living before. It is organized around a fundamentally different relationship to the most essential capacity they carry. The perception is no longer the thing that happens to them. It is the thing they do, consciously, deliberately, in the service of genuine engagement with the world. The relationships available to this empath are qualitatively different, deeper, more genuinely mutual, organized around authentic encounter rather than around the empath's invisible, perceptive labor on behalf of people who never became aware it was occurring. The work available is more genuinely aligned with what the gift actually makes possible. And the interior life is richer, more genuinely inhabited, because the empath is finally present in it, rather than dispersed through everyone else's. Jung's framework ultimately returns, across all of its applications, across all of the specific concepts it brings to bear on every dimension of psychological experience, to one essential recognition, that the individual's most genuine development is, paradoxically, the most significant contribution they can make to the collective. The empath, who develops the deep perception gift correctly, who does the interior work that correct use requires, who becomes increasingly capable of genuine presence with another's interior reality. This development is not a private achievement. It is a collective resource. Every person whose life intersects with a genuinely developed empath benefits from a quality of encounter that the world currently produces at insufficient scale. The development of the gift is not only in service of the empath, it is in service of everyone who needs what only the empath can provide. The deep perception that the empath carries is, at its most essential, a specific form of connection. The form that makes possible contact with what is most real in another person, rather than with what is most managed. In a world that generates elaborate structures for the management of interiority, for the presentation of acceptable versions of the self to the carefully curated audiences that social life provides, the empath's perception cuts through these structures to what is genuinely present beneath them. This capacity to connect at the level of what is real is not only the empath's gift, it is what they were built for. The development of it, the protection of it, the correct use of it, this is not supplementary to the empath's life. It is the center of it. And discovering that center, understanding what the perception actually is, what it makes possible, and how to use it in genuine service, is among the most significant recognitions available to any empath who has been living with the gift without fully understanding what they carry. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "My perception is my gift." And I've placed another lesson on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.